I arrived at my childhood home in suburban Phoenix after completing my second tour in Iraq. I expected to surprise my family, but found the house eerily quiet. Following a faint coughing sound, I discovered my 83-year-old grandmother Margaret lying in a hospital bed in the guest room, severely malnourished, with bed sores, clutching an old photo. The house smelled of neglect, Margaret whispered Tricia, with disbelief, tears streaming down her sunken cheeks. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification showing my parents, David and Linda, toasting margaritas on a Cabo beach, captioned, "Living our best life." The sight of my grandmother broke my heart in ways that combat never could. Margaret's once plump cheeks had hollowed into sharp angles, her silver hair matted against a yellowed pillowcase. The floral nightgown she wore hung loose around her shrinking frame, and I could smell the sour odor of unwashed skin mixed with something medicinal and wrong. "Grandma, when did you last eat?" I asked, rushing to her bedside and taking her frail hand in mine. Her fingers felt like brittle twigs, cold despite the Arizona heat filtering through dirty windows. She blinked slowly, as if trying to focus. "Yesterday morning, I think, or maybe the day before. Time gets fuzzy, honey." I glanced around the guest room where she'd been moved after her stroke 6 months ago. Empty water glasses sat on the nightstand alongside pill bottles with labels so old the dates had faded. A medical alert button lay tangled in the bedsheets, clearly unused for weeks. Racing to the kitchen, I discovered a refrigerator containing only expired yogurt, moldy bread, and a carton of milk that had curdled into chunks. The sink overflowed with dishes, and fruit flies circled a bowl of rotting bananas. Bills scattered across the counter showed red final notice stamps from the electric company, water department, and medical supply company. My hands shook as I opened cabinet after cabinet, finding nothing but dust and empty containers. The house felt like a tomb, with dust particles dancing in shafts of sunlight that revealed fingerprints on every surface except where someone might have recently cleaned. Returning to Margaret with a glass of fresh water from my car, I helped her sit up slowly. She winced as she moved, and I noticed the angry red pressure sores on her back and shoulders where she'd been lying in the same position for too long. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. Margaret's eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "They said they'd be back in a few days." "That was how long ago?" 3 weeks. They hired a nice girl named Patricia to help me, but she stopped coming after the first week. Said something about not getting paid. My phone buzzed again. Another Facebook post from my mother. A selfie of her and my father at what looked like an expensive seafood restaurant, both grinning widely with lobster bibs around their necks. The caption read, "Date night in paradise. Sometimes you just have to treat yourselves." The comments below made my blood boil. Family, friends, and neighbors praising my parents for their dedication to caring for Margaret, telling them they deserved a break after being such devoted caregivers. One comment from our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, read, "You two are angels. Margaret is so lucky to have children who care for her so well. If only they knew the truth." I scrolled through weeks of posts documenting my parents' Mexican vacation, professional massages at resort spas, deep-sea fishing expeditions on private boats, wine tastings at exclusive vineyards, shopping sprees in boutique stores. Every single post bragged about their well-earned retirement and how they were finally living for themselves. Meanwhile, my grandmother had been dying alone. I tried calling my father's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Same with my mother's number. When I tried calling from Margaret's landline, thinking maybe they'd blocked my number, I got through but heard my father's voice say, "We can't take your call right now. We're living our dream vacation and we'll get back to you when we feel like it." Then the line went dead. They'd blocked every number associated with this house. Searching through the scattered papers on the kitchen counter, I found something that made my chest tighten with rage. Bank statements showing regular deposits of Margaret's Social Security benefits and pension payments totaling over $4,000 monthly. But the checking account balance showed only $67. Where had all that money gone? I found my answer in credit card statements mixed in with the medical bills. Charges for first-class flights to Mexico, five-star hotel suites, expensive restaurants and bars, luxury shopping sprees, rental cars and resort activities. My parents had been living like royalty on my grandmother's income while she starved in her own home. Margaret watched me from the doorway, having somehow managed to get into her wheelchair on her own. Honey, you look upset. Is everything all right? How could I tell her that her own son had abandoned her to die while stealing her money? How could I explain that the people shed, raised, and loved had treated her like a burden to be discarded? Everything's going to be okay now, Grandma, I said, though I wasn't sure how I'd make that promise true. I'm here, and am not going anywhere. But as I helped her back to bed and began searching for edible food to order for delivery, I realized this wasn't just neglect. The empty pill bottles, the disconnected medical equipment, the isolation from family and friends, all pointed to something far more sinister. My parents hadn't just abandoned Margaret. They'd set up the perfect conditions for her to die alone and forgotten, with no witnesses to contradict whatever story they'd tell when they eventually returned. The next morning, while helping Margaret with a gentle sponge bath, I noticed her wincing as she tried to reach for an old jewelry box on her nightstand. The simple wooden box had been her treasure chest for as long as I could remember, filled with costume jewelry and mementos from her 50-year marriage to my grandfather Harold. Let me get that for you, I said, lifting the box carefully and setting it on her lap. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the faded velvet interior, revealing layers of necklaces and brooches that sparkled with memories. But instead of reaching for jewelry, she pressed against the bottom of the box until a hidden compartment clicked open. Tricia, there's something your grandfather wanted you to have, she whispered, pulling out a small brass key attached to a piece of paper with Harold's distinctive handwriting. But I'd forgotten all about it until just now. My mind has been so foggy lately. I read the note aloud. For my granddaughter, Tricia. The basement safe is behind the water heater. Combination is your birthday plus mine. Some secrets need protecting from those who would abuse them. My heart raced. Grandfather Harold had died 3 years ago, and I'd always wondered why Head seemed so distant from my parents during his final months. Now I was beginning to understand. In the basement, behind the old water heater that had been there since my childhood, I found a small, fireproof safe built into the foundation wall. The combination lock opened easily. My birthday, March 15th, 1995, followed by Harold's birthday, August 22nd, 1938. Inside, I discovered a treasure trove of documents that would change everything. Harold's will, dated just 2 years ago and properly notarized, left everything to Margaret during her lifetime. Upon her death, the entire estate would pass to me, completely bypassing my parents. The document was thorough and specific. The house worth $300,000, investment accounts totaling $400,000, a life insurance policy worth $100,000, and various other assets bringing Margaret's total net worth to over $800,000. But it wasn't just the money that shocked me. Harold had documented everything. Bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals that coincided with my father's gambling trips to Las Vegas, photocopied checks with Harold's forged signature, some dated just weeks before his death, a detailed log of my father's attempts to pressure Harold into changing the will, including recorded phone conversations where my father threatened to put Harold in a cheap nursing home if he didn't cooperate. Most heartbreaking was a letter addressed specifically to me. Dearest Tricia, if you're reading this, then your grandmother needs protection from your father's greed. I've watched David steal from our workshop, lie about family emergencies to get money, and treat your mother like his personal accomplice in bleeding our family dry. Your mother, Linda, enables his gambling addiction by demanding expensive vacations and shopping sprees they can't afford. They see your grandmother as nothing more than a bank account with an inconvenient heartbeat attached. I've arranged this inheritance to ensure Margaret is cared for properly, and that you, the only family member who truly cares about others, Receive what should rightfully help you build a good life. The evidence in this safe will protect her if David tries anything criminal. Use it wisely. Love always, Grandpa Harold. Beneath the letter, I found even more disturbing evidence. Recent medical records that my parents had intercepted showed Margaret's doctors trying desperately to reach her family about her deteriorating condition. Notes from Dr. Sarah Patterson, Margaret's primary care physician, indicated growing concern about family unresponsiveness to medical recommendations and patient isolation from social support systems. One report from just 2 weeks ago recommended immediate intervention for Margaret's malnutrition and medication management issues. The doctor had been calling my parents daily, leaving urgent voicemails about Margaret's declining condition, but they'd never returned a single call. There were also financial documents showing Margaret's true income sources. Beyond Social Security and her pension, she received quarterly dividend payments from smart investments Harold had made decades ago. My parents had been intercepting and depositing all of this money while telling Margaret that her fixed income barely covered basic expenses. The safe contained one more devastating piece of evidence: a folder labeled Insurance Fraud Investigation. Harold had discovered that my father had increased Margaret's life insurance policy without her knowledge and changed the beneficiary from me to himself. When Harold confronted him, my father had laughed and said, "She won't need it where she's going." Harold had reported this to the insurance company and the authorities, but his death had interrupted the investigation. All the evidence was here, waiting for someone to act on it. I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by proof of my parents' betrayal, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak that made my chest physically ache. My grandfather had spent his final years trying to protect Margaret from her own son, knowing that David would drain every penny from her accounts while letting her suffer in neglect. But Harold's planning had given me something my parents didn't expect: the legal power to fight back and the evidence to destroy their schemes completely. As I climbed the basement stairs with the safe's contents, I realized that my war wasn't over when I came home from Iraq. It was just beginning. And this time I was fighting to protect the most important person in my world from enemies who shared our last name. Back in Margaret's room, I spread Harold's documents across her bedside table, watching her face crumple as the full scope of her son's betrayal became clear. But it was the phone numbers listed in Harold's notes that led to the most heartbreaking discoveries of all. Margaret's sister Helen, who lived in Denver, answered on the first ring. Her voice carried the weight of months of worry and confusion. "Trisha. Oh my goodness, honey. How are you? How's your grandmother? David told us she's been in specialized care and can't receive visitors or phone calls. We've been so worried, but he said she specifically requested no contact because she's embarrassed about her memory problems." My throat tightened as I realized the web of lies my parents had constructed. "Aunt Helen, I need to tell you something difficult. Grandma has been at home this whole time, and she's been asking about family constantly. She had no idea that you'd been trying to reach her." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like minutes. When Helen finally spoke, her voice cracked with emotion. "What do you mean?" "I've been sending cards and money for her care every month. David said the facility wouldn't allow direct contact, but that he'd make sure she got everything." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. "What kind of money, Aunt Helen?" $500 monthly to help with her medical expenses. David said her insurance didn't cover everything and that they were struggling financially. I've been sending checks for 8 months now, $4,000 that Margaret had never seen, never knew existed. Helen's daughter Emma, who worked for a law firm in Colorado Springs, called me within an hour of speaking with her mother. Her legal training had immediately recognized the signs of a systematic crime. "Trisha, what you're describing is textbook elder abuse with financial exploitation," Emma explained. "But it sounds like your parents have been running a much larger operation than just stealing from Margaret. We need to contact other family members immediately." Over the next several hours, I made call after call to relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, uncovering a pattern of deception that stretched back months. Margaret's brother James, in Portland, had been sending monthly checks for $300, believing Margaret was in an expensive memory care facility. Cousin Sarah in Dallas had contributed $2,000 last Christmas for specialized equipment that Margaret supposedly needed. Even distant relatives had been contacted by my father with elaborate stories about Margaret's care requirements and the family's financial struggles. Every single relative had been told that Margaret specifically didn't want contact because she was ashamed of her declining mental state. Every single one had been contributing money to help with her care, believing they were being compassionate and supportive. In total, my parents had collected over $15,000 from relatives in the past 8 months alone, all while telling Margaret that her family had forgotten about her and moved on with their lives. But the cruelest discovery came when I called Margaret's best friend Dorothy, who had been her companion for over 20 years. Dorothy sobbed when she heard my voice. "Oh, honey, I've been trying to visit your grandmother for months. Every time I call, your parents tell me she's sleeping or having a bad day with her memory. They said she gets agitated when visitors come and that the doctor recommended limiting social interaction." Dorothy had been bringing homemade meals to the house for weeks, leaving them on the porch when my parents claimed Margaret was too tired for company. Those meals had been thrown away while Margaret starved alone inside. They told me Shed asked specifically not to see me because my visits made her sad about her condition, Dorothy whispered. I believed them because they're her children. I thought they knew best. I found those discarded meal containers in the garage trash, moldy remnants of love that could have kept Margaret fed and connected to someone who truly cared about her well-being. Even more disturbing was the medical manipulation I uncovered. Margaret's neurologist, Dr. Michael Chen, had been prescribing a mild medication to help with anxiety following her stroke, but when I checked the pill bottles in her room, I found sleeping pills and anxiety medications with dosages far higher than anything Dr. Chen had prescribed. My father had been visiting different doctors, claiming to be Margaret's primary caregiver and requesting stronger medications for her increasing agitation and sleep problems. Had been collecting multiple prescriptions and mixing them into Margaret's food to keep her sedated and compliant. A call to Margaret's pharmacy revealed the shocking truth. My father had been picking up medications prescribed by 3 different doctors, none of whom knew about the others. The pharmacist, Mr. Kumar, expressed concern about the combination of drugs but had been assured by my father that the doctors were coordinating her care. Margaret had been essentially drugged into compliance, kept in a fog of confusion that made it impossible for her to reach out for help or understand what was happening to her. I found evidence of even more betrayals hidden in Harold's files. My parents had been gradually selling Margaret's valuable possessions over the past year. Her mother's china set, worth several $1,000s, had been sold to an antique dealer. Jewelry that Harold had given her for anniversaries had been appraised and sold through online auction sites. Even her collection of first edition books had been liquidated for cash. Each time, they'd told Margaret that items had been donated to charity or had accidentally been damaged and needed to be discarded. Shed grieved for these lost memories while my parents pocketed the proceeds. Medical records revealed that Margaret's condition had declined rapidly starting 6 months ago, precisely when my parents had increased their control over her care. Before that, she'd been managing well with minimal assistance, driving herself to appointments and maintaining social connections. The systematic isolation, medication manipulation, and financial exploitation had created the perfect conditions for a vulnerable elderly woman to deteriorate rapidly, while everyone who cared about her was kept away by lies and false reassurances. As I sat with Margaret that evening, helping her eat her first real meal in weeks, I realized that this wasn't just theft or neglect. My parents had orchestrated a comprehensive plan to erase Margaret's independence, steal her assets, and hasten her death while maintaining the public appearance of devoted caregivers. They'd turned her son's home into a prison and her family's love into a weapon against her. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the little girl who used to sit on Harold's lap, listening to his stories about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Harold had left me the tools to fight back, and tomorrow I would begin dismantling every lie they'd built around my grandmother's suffering. By dawn, I'd created a war room in Harold's old study, spreading evidence across his massive oak desk like a battle plan. Emma had driven down from Colorado Springs overnight, bringing legal documents and a determination that reminded me of Margaret in her younger years. "Tricia, what we have here is enough for multiple felony charges," Emma said, photographing each document with professional precision. "Elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft, insurance fraud, and conspiracy." Margaret sat in Harold's old recliner, looking stronger after 2 days of proper nutrition and medication management. Her mind had cleared significantly once Wed stopped the unauthorized sedatives my father had been mixing into her food. "I can't believe my own son would do this to me," she whispered, clutching a photo of my father as a child. "Harold tried to warn me, but I thought he was just being overprotective. David was always my baby, always needed extra help and support." Emma's phone rang, and she answered with the confidence that came from years of prosecuting financial crimes. After a brief conversation, she turned to us with news that changed everything. That was my contact at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. They've been tracking an elder abuse ring that operates across state lines, using family relationships to exploit vulnerable seniors. Your parents fit the exact profile they've been investigating. She explained that organized elder abuse often involved family members who isolated victims, manipulated medications, intercepted communications, and systematically drained assets while maintaining public facades of devoted care. What my parents had done to Margaret wasn't just cruel. It was part of a pattern that authorities had been working to expose. But Emma's next call brought even more urgent news. Shed contacted Margaret's bank to freeze the accounts and discovered something chilling. My parents had been making unusual transactions all week, transferring large sums to offshore accounts and making cash withdrawals that exceeded normal patterns. "They're liquidating everything," Emma said grimly. "Your grandmother's investment accounts have been nearly emptied in the past 2 weeks. I think they know you're home, and they're trying to move the money before anyone can stop them." I checked my parents' Facebook pages and found confirmation of Emma's fears. The vacation posts had stopped 3 days ago, and their last location tag showed them at Cabo's airport. According to my father's travel app, which had foolishly linked to his social media, they'd changed their return flight from next week to today. They were coming home early, and based on the frantic money transfers, they knew something had gone wrong with their plans. Emma worked through the night with her legal contacts, preparing emergency court orders to freeze all of Margaret's accounts and prevent any further asset transfers. We installed discreet security cameras throughout the house, hidden in picture frames and behind furniture, positioning them to capture any conversations or actions when my parents returned. But the most important preparation was helping Margaret understand her own strength. As her mind cleared from the medication fog, her natural intelligence and determination began to resurface. She'd been a high school principal for 30 years before retiring, and that authority hadn't disappeared despite my parents' attempts to diminish her. "I want to confront them myself," Margaret said firmly as we reviewed our plans. "They need to hear from their victim directly. They need to see that I'm not the confused, helpless old woman they've been telling everyone about." Dr. Patterson arrived for an emergency house call, documenting Margaret's condition and the evidence of medication tampering. Her medical report would provide crucial evidence for criminal charges, but more importantly, it confirmed that Margaret was mentally competent to make legal decisions and understand the situation fully. "Mrs. Thompson, your cognitive function is excellent," Dr. Patterson assured Margaret. "The confusion and memory problems you've been experiencing were directly caused by the unauthorized medications you've been given. As those leave your system, your mental clarity will continue to improve." It'd also been working with Margaret's original attorney, Mr. David Hoffman, who had drafted Harold's will and managed their legal affairs for decades. When he arrived to review Harold's documents, his face grew increasingly serious. "Tricia, your grandfather was more thorough than I realized. Mr. Hoffman said Examining the evidence Harold had collected, he suspected fraud and began documenting everything before his death. This safe contains enough evidence to support criminal charges and complete asset recovery. But Mr. Hoffman also brought disturbing news about my parents' recent activities. They'd visited his office 2 weeks ago, claiming to have legal power of attorney for Margaret and demanding to know details about her estate and inheritance plans. When Head refused to share confidential information without Margaret's direct consent, they'd become aggressive and threatening. Your father specifically asked about life insurance policies and when Margaret's estate would be settled, Mr. Hoffman explained. The way he phrased his questions suggested he was expecting her death sooner rather than later. That evening, as we finalized our preparations, Helen arrived from Denver with 2 other relatives I hadn't seen in years. Uncle James had flown in from Portland, and Cousin Sarah had driven up from Dallas. All of them brought checkbooks and receipts showing the money they'd sent for Margaret's care, money that had been stolen and spent on luxury vacations. "We're here to support you and Grandma, whatever happens," Helen said, hugging Margaret with tears in her eyes. None of us realized what was happening, but we're not going to let it continue. The family unity that my parents had worked so hard to destroy was rebuilding itself around Margaret's kitchen table. Stories emerged of phone calls that had been intercepted, visits that had been discouraged, and a systematic campaign to convince everyone that Margaret wanted to be left alone. As we sat together that night, Margaret looked around the table at faces she'd been told didn't care about her anymore. The strength that my parents had tried to steal was returning, fueled by the love and support of family members who'd never stopped caring. Tomorrow, when they come home expecting to find a dying old woman alone and helpless, they're going to discover that they picked the wrong family to mess with, Margaret said, with a determination that reminded me exactly whose granddaughter I was. Harold's plan was about to be put into action, and justice was finally coming for the people who'd betrayed the woman who'd given them everything. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway sent adrenaline through my system like the moment before combat. Margaret sat straighter in her wheelchair, her jaw set with the same determination I'd seen in old photos of her during her teaching days. The hidden cameras were recording, legal documents were in place, and 3 days of evidence gathering was about to pay off. My father's key turned in the lock at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. I heard his voice first, artificially cheerful and loud, as if he was performing for an audience. "Honey, we're home. Sorry we had to cut the vacation short, but we missed taking care of Mom too much to stay away." My mother's laughter sounded forced and nervous. "I hope Patricia took good care of everything while we were gone. We brought back some beautiful souvenirs for everyone." They stopped dead when they saw me sitting calmly at the kitchen table, still wearing my Army combat boots and the confidence that 2 tours in Iraq had given me. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like fear. "Tricia, what a wonderful surprise." My mother rushed forward with arms outstretched, her voice pitched too high. "We had no idea you were home. Why didn't you call us?" "I did call," I said evenly, not moving from my chair. "Several times, but you seemed too busy living your best life to answer." My father's eyes were already scanning the house, noting the clean dishes, the filled refrigerator visible through the open kitchen door, and the general sense of order that hadn't existed when they'd left. His vacation tan made his guilty expression even more obvious. "Where's Patricia?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "We paid her good money to take care of Mom." "Patricia stopped coming after the first week when her paycheck bounced," I replied calmly. "Something about insufficient funds in the account you set up for her." My mother's fake smile wavered. "Oh, that must have been a banking error. We'll get that sorted out right away. Where's Mom? Is she resting?" "Grandma's in the living room," I said, standing slowly. "She's been waiting to see you. She has some questions about her care while you were gone." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut as we all moved toward the living room. Margaret sat in Harold's old recliner, looking far more alert and strong than my parents expected. The hospital bed had been moved out, replaced by the comfortable furniture she'd always preferred. "Hello, David," Margaret said, her voice carrying decades of disappointment. "Linda, I trust you enjoyed Mexico." My father's attempt at casual affection fell flat as he leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Mom, you look wonderful. Patricia must have taken excellent care of you. We brought you some beautiful jewelry from the local artisans down there." "That's thoughtful," Margaret replied coolly, "though I'm curious how you afforded such an extended vacation on your retirement income. 3 weeks in Cabo must have been expensive." The first crack in their facade appeared when my mother glanced nervously at my father. They'd expected to find Margaret confused and weak, easily managed with more lies and manipulation. Instead, they faced a sharp, alert woman who was asking direct questions. "Well, Mom, we've been saving for this trip for years," my father said, his voice becoming defensive. "Linda and I have sacrificed a lot to take care of you, and we deserve some time for ourselves." "Of course you do," Margaret agreed. "I'm just wondering how you managed to save $43,000 while telling me that money was too tight to afford my physical therapy sessions." The room went completely silent. My father's face flushed red, and my mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of panic I'd seen since childhood. "Mom, I don't know where you're getting those numbers," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We've been very careful with your fixed income, making sure every penny goes toward your care." I stood and walked to Harold's desk, pulling out the bank statements that showed every transaction. $43,000 in 3 weeks, Dad. First-class flights, 5-star hotels, private boat charters, exclusive restaurants, all paid for with Grandma's money while she sat here without food or medication. My mother's composure finally cracked. "Tricia, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. Taking care of an elderly person is exhausting, and we haven't had a break in months. We were planning to pay everything back once our pension payments caught up." "What pension payments?" Margaret asked, sharply. "David, you've been retired for 2 years and Linda never worked outside the home. What pension were you expecting?" The lies were unraveling faster than my parents could reconstruct them. My father's face hardened into an expression I remembered from childhood, the look he got when caught in wrongdoing and cornered into admitting it. "Look, Mom, the truth is that taking care of you has become more than we can handle," he said, dropping the pretense of loving concern. "You're getting worse every month, and the medical expenses are draining everyone's resources. Linda and I decided to take some of your money for the vacation because we figured you'd want us to have some happiness before." He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Before what, David?" Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Before you get too much worse and we have to make some difficult decisions about your care," my mother finished weakly. Margaret's eyes blazed with a fury I'd rarely seen. "Difficult decisions? Like keeping me drugged and isolated while you steal everything Harold worked his whole life to build? Like telling my family I don't want to see them while collecting money supposedly for my care?" My father's mask of concern finally fell away completely. "We've been breaking our backs taking care of you. Do you have any idea what you cost us? The time, the energy, the money? We're your children, and we deserve something for all our sacrifice." "What sacrifice?" I interjected, my voice cutting through his self-pity. "You abandoned her for 3 weeks, while she nearly died. You've been drugging her food, stealing her money, and lying to everyone who cares about her. What exactly have you sacrificed except your basic humanity?" My father turned on me with the rage of a man whose elaborate schemes were crumbling around him. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You disappeared into the army for years while we dealt with everything here. Now you come home and act like some kind of hero. But where were you when we needed help?" The accusation stung because part of me had always felt guilty about leaving for military service. But looking at Margaret, seeing the strength returning to her eyes and the determination in her voice, I realized that guilt was misplaced. "I was serving my country," I said quietly. "But it looks like I should have been protecting Grandma from her own family instead." My mother tried one last manipulation, tears streaming down her face in a performance that might have worked if I hadn't seen her laughing on social media just days earlier. Trisha, honey, you have to understand. We love Mom, but we're getting older too. We can't sacrifice our entire lives to take care of someone who might live for years in this condition. We thought if we took some money now, we could enjoy our retirement while we're still healthy enough to travel. Margaret's response was calm and devastating. Linda, I've been sitting here for months, watching you count down the days until my death like you're waiting for Christmas morning. But there's something you don't know about your inheritance plans. She gestured to the desk where Harold's will lay open, surrounded by evidence of their crimes. Harold changed his will 2 years ago. When I die, everything goes to Trisha. You two get absolutely nothing. The color drained from both their faces as the reality hit them. All their scheming, all their cruelty, all their patient waiting for Margaret's death had been based on an assumption that was completely wrong. But instead of shame or remorse, my father's response was pure rage. That's impossible. You can't cut us out completely. We're your children. You stopped being my children the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive, Margaret said with finality. That's when my father made the threat that sealed his fate forever. My father's voice turned cold and threatening in a way that reminded me of the dangerous men he'd faced overseas. Mom, you're going to change that will back to the way it should be, or Linda and I are going to have to make some decisions about your care that you won't like. What kind of decisions? Margaret asked, though her steady voice showed she already knew the answer. The kind where you don't get to make choices anymore, my father replied, stepping closer to her chair. We can have you declared incompetent. We can put you in the cheapest state facility we can find. We can make sure you never see Trisha or anyone else in this family again. My mother nodded eagerly, encouraged by his aggression. David's right, Mom. You're not thinking clearly because of your condition. We're trying to help you make smart decisions about your future. But Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bullies and troublemakers. David, there's something else you don't know. Harold didn't just change the will. He documented everything you've been doing for the past 2 years. My father's face went pale. What are you talking about? I stood and walked to Harold's safe, pulling out the folder of evidence that had been waiting for this moment. Grandpa knew you'd been forging his signature on checks. He recorded your phone calls where you threatened to put him in a nursing home. He documented every time you pressured him to change his will. As I spread the photocopied checks and bank statements across the coffee table, my father's tough facade began to crumble. That's impossible. Dad was confused in his final years. Nothing he documented would hold up anywhere. Maybe not by itself, I agreed. But combined with the evidence we've gathered this week, it paints a pretty complete picture. My mother's voice rose to a panicked whine. What evidence? We've been taking care of Mom exactly like we said we would. I pulled out my phone and began playing recordings from the past 3 days. Margaret's doctor confirming she'd been given unauthorized medications, Aunt Helen describing the money she'd been sending that Margaret never received, the pharmacy records showing multiple doctors prescribing conflicting medications. We also have testimony from Patricia, the caregiver you hired and then refused to pay, I continued. She's been documenting everything she witnessed, including your instructions to keep Mom quiet and sleepy during her shifts. My father's anger turned into something uglier. None of this means anything. We're her family, and we'll do whatever we think is best for her care. If that means adjusting her medications to keep her comfortable, that's our right as her caregivers. Margaret's eyes blazed. Comfortable? You mean drugged unconscious so I couldn't call for help or understand what you were doing to me. But my father was beyond reasoning now. He stepped toward Margaret's chair with his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment I thought he might actually become physically violent. You're going to sign papers giving us control of everything, or we're going to make your life very unpleasant, he snarled. Trisha can't stay here forever, and when she leaves, you'll be right back where you started. That's when he made the mistake that ended everything. And if you keep being difficult, We might have to adjust your medications again, permanently this time." The threat hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Emma stepped out of the hallway where she'd been listening to everything. "David and Linda Thompson, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud," she announced, showing her identification. "You have the right to remain silent." Behind her, 2 police officers entered through the front door, followed by an investigator from Adult Protective Services and a representative from the district attorney's office. My parents' faces went through shock, confusion, and then panic as they realized how completely they'd been trapped. The hidden cameras had recorded their entire confession, and their threats against Margaret had been witnessed by multiple law enforcement officials. "This is entrapment," my father shouted as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You set us up." "Actually," Emma replied calmly, "you confessed to multiple felonies in front of witnesses after threatening violence against your elderly mother. We just gave you enough rope to hang yourselves with." My mother collapsed into hysterical tears, begging Margaret to forgive her and claiming she'd been pressured into everything by my father. But her Facebook posts celebrating their expensive vacation while Margaret starved told a different story. "Linda, I raised you like my own daughter for 30 years, Margaret said sadly. "I trusted you with my most vulnerable moments, and you repaid that trust by planning my death for profit. There's no forgiveness for that level of betrayal." As the authorities led my parents away, Detective Rodriguez explained the charges they were facing: elder abuse, financial exploitation, identity theft, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder through medication tampering. The evidence was overwhelming, and the confession they'd just recorded sealed their fate. "Mrs. Thompson, your granddaughter's quick thinking and your husband's preparation have given us one of the strongest elder abuse cases I've ever seen," Detective Rodriguez told Margaret. "These charges carry significant prison time, and we'll be working to recover every penny they stole from you." Emma had also brought good news about the financial investigation. My parents' desperate attempts to move money to offshore accounts had been blocked by emergency court orders. The Mexican property they'd purchased with stolen funds was being seized by international law enforcement. Even their expensive vacation purchases were being cataloged as evidence of their crimes. Within hours, Margaret's accounts were secured, and all stolen funds were frozen pending asset recovery. The relatives who'd sent money for her care would be refunded through the criminal restitution process. But the most satisfying moment came when Margaret's phone began ringing with calls from family members and friends who'd been kept away by lies and manipulation. Word of the arrests had spread quickly, and people who'd been told Margaret didn't want contact were finally learning the truth. Dorothy arrived with a casserole and tears of joy, hugging Margaret like she'd returned from the dead. Dr. Patterson called to schedule proper medical care now that Margaret was free from unauthorized medication interference. Even distant relatives began calling to reconnect with the woman they'd been told didn't want to hear from them. As the evening settled around us, Margaret sat surrounded by evidence that love had triumphed over greed, that truth had conquered manipulation, and that Harold's careful planning had protected her when she needed it most. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," she told me, holding my hand with strength that had returned along with her hope. "He always said the most important battle isn't against enemies outside the family, but against the ones who use love as a weapon." The people who'd betrayed her trust were gone, facing justice for their crimes. But the family who truly loved her was gathering back around her, stronger than ever, because they'd fought for something that mattered more than money or convenience. Margaret was safe, her assets were protected, and the truth had finally set everyone free. 6 months after my parents' arrest, I stood in Margaret's new apartment at Sunrise Manor, the most beautiful assisted living community in Phoenix, watching her laugh with her new bridge group as they planned their next tournament strategy. The transformation in her health and spirits seemed almost miraculous, but Dr. Patterson had explained that removing toxic people from someone's life often had healing effects that went beyond simple medical treatment. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once prosecutors reviewed the overwhelming evidence. My father received 7 years in federal prison for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. My mother got 5 years after cooperating with authorities and providing details about their systematic plan to isolate and exploit Margaret. Both were ordered to pay complete restitution and were permanently banned from contact with Margaret under federal victim protection statutes. The recovery of Margaret's stolen assets had exceeded even Emma's expectations. Beyond the obvious theft of her monthly income, investigators discovered my parents had been running their elder abuse scheme for much longer than WED initially realized. They'd been systematically selling Margaret's possessions, intercepting payments from relatives, and even collecting money from neighbors who'd wanted to help with her care expenses. In total, over $60,000 was recovered and returned to Margaret's accounts, along with the proceeds from selling the Mexican property my parents had purchased with stolen funds. Harold's careful investment planning meant that Margaret's net worth had actually grown during her recovery, giving her the financial security to afford the highest quality care for the rest of her life. But the money wasn't what mattered most to Margaret. What transformed her life was the restoration of her connections to people who genuinely cared about her well-being. Aunt Helen had moved to Phoenix to be closer to Margaret, renting a small apartment just 10 minutes from Sunrise Manor. She visited 3 times a week, and their relationship had deepened into something beautiful as they made up for the months they'd been kept apart by lies and manipulation. Dorothy had become Margaret's constant companion, picking her up for shopping trips and medical appointments with the devotion of a true friend. Their friendship had strengthened rather than diminished. After learning how it had been weaponized against Margaret's well-being, even distant relatives had reconnected, understanding finally that the woman they'd been told was too confused and antisocial to maintain relationships was actually sharp, funny, and delighted to hear from people who cared about her. Margaret's medical recovery had been equally remarkable. Once doctor, Patterson removed all the unauthorized medications and treated the malnutrition and dehydration. Margaret's cognitive function returned to normal levels for someone her age. Her physical therapy sessions had restored much of her mobility, and she now walked independently with just a simple cane for balance. The brain fog and confusion your parents attributed to natural aging was actually caused by drug interactions and nutritional deficiencies. Dr. Patterson explained during Margaret's 6-month checkup. Proper nutrition, appropriate medication management, and social stimulation have given her back years of healthy mental function. For me, the healing process had been more complex but equally transformative. Using my military benefits, I'd completed my bachelor's degree in social work and taken a position with the Arizona Department of Elder Services, specializing in family exploitation cases. My experience with Margaret had shown me a mission that felt as important as my military service. Harold's house had been sold as had planned, with proceeds going into a trust fund for Margaret's care and my education. I'd used part of my inheritance to purchase a small house near Sunrise Manor, close enough to visit Margaret regularly, but far enough to give her independence and privacy. The work I'd found with Elder Services brought daily reminders of why Harold's planning had been so crucial. Elder abuse was far more common than most people realized, often perpetrated by family members who viewed aging relatives as financial opportunities rather than human beings deserving respect and care. My first successful case involved an 87-year-old veteran whose son had been forging his disability checks while keeping him isolated in a care facility that barely met basic standards. Using techniques I'd learned from Margaret's situation, we gathered evidence, coordinated with law enforcement, and recovered over $30,000 while relocating the veteran to appropriate care. Each case reinforced what Harold had taught me through his careful documentation, that protecting vulnerable people required planning, courage, and sometimes the willingness to fight against those who should have been providing protection instead. Margaret had thrown herself into advocacy work as well, speaking at community centers and senior groups about recognizing signs of family financial exploitation. Her presentations were powerful because she spoke from experience about how isolation and manipulation could make even smart, educated people vulnerable to abuse. The most dangerous part wasn't the money they stole, Margaret often told her audiences. It was how they convinced me that people who loved me had stopped caring. Isolation is the weapon that makes everything else possible. Her speeches had led to policy changes in how Arizona investigated elder abuse cases and how financial institutions flagged suspicious activities in elderly customers' accounts. Margaret's experience had become a case study in several law enforcement training programs, but the most meaningful transformation had been in Margaret's relationship with her own strength and value. The woman had been convinced she was a burden, had rediscovered her worth as a teacher, mentor, and survivor who could help others avoid the trap she'd escaped. On the anniversary of my return from Iraq, Margaret and I sat on her apartment balcony, watching the sunset over the Phoenix Mountains, while she planned her next bridge tournament, and I reviewed case files for my work with elder services. "You know what Harold would say about all this?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the life shed rebuilt around herself. I smiled, remembering my grandfather's favorite saying about confronting difficult situations. He'd say the most important battles are fought for people who can't fight for themselves, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to speak difficult truths, Margaret added, raising her glass of iced tea and a mock toast. Harry's, to granddaughters who come home when they're needed most. As the sun set on another peaceful day in Margaret's new life, I reflected on how military service had prepared me for combat overseas, but it was coming home that taught me the most important lessons about courage, loyalty, and the kind of battles that truly matter. Harold's legacy lived on in the safety Margaret had found, the justice that had been served, and the knowledge that love backed by action could triumph over greed disguised as care. The family that truly mattered had been strengthened by surviving the betrayal of those who'd tried to destroy it. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who were taking advantage of someone you love? How did you find the courage to speak up when it really mattered? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life who might need protection, please don't hesitate to reach out to local elder services for guidance and support. Thank you so much for listening to Margaret's journey from betrayal to justice. Remember to like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe for more stories about courage and family loyalty, and share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that standing up for vulnerable people is always worth the fight. Until next time, remember that the strongest families are built on truth, respect, and the willingness to protect those who need it most.